The world is now struggling to contain the novel coronavirus, but the invisible enemy still continues to wreak havoc across the world. People are going to quarantine, cities are in lockdown, and businesses are closed. Italy has shut down its factories, and soon other countries in crisis will do the same. How humanity can recover from all this is to be seen. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Leila Faromarzi, and in this episode of The Outbreak, we'll discuss the effects of massive closure of industries due to the pandemic.
Last week, the deadly coronavirus pandemic forced Italy's government to shut down non-essential factories as yet another measure to halt the outbreak. This was certainly a difficult decision, but the death toll kept rising so drastically that it seemed closing factories was something like the last resort. Italy is Europe's fourth largest economy, and by shutting down its factories, it made an extremely risky decision. But when it comes to saving human lives, governments should spare no effort. Italy has always been a forerunner of shifts, whether political or otherwise, in Europe and beyond. What Italy has done will soon become one of the options in front of other countries as well. It's a matter of time now.
We do expect it to be quite deep, and we are very much urging countries to step up containment measures aggressively so we can shorten the duration of this period of time when the economy is in standstill.
The rise in the number of cases and deaths in France and Germany suggests that those countries are where Italy was about 10 days ago. If the euro crisis a decade ago showed the risk of economic contagion, the coronavirus outbreak is a contagion of a higher order. When the coronavirus arrived in Italy's industrial heartland, it shut down factories and threatened Europe with economic damage. Italy makes parts for the electrical systems of cars, supplying some of the world's largest automobile manufacturers. Now that Italy has slowed down, many car makers across the world have to slow down too. This means the economy, not just in Italy, but across the globe, has to slow down. What happened to the auto factories was just an example. In fact, Italy was just an example. Think bigger. What will happen if Europe's industry sector slows down? Too dramatic? It certainly is. We are not living in an isolated world, so if a nation slows down its production engines, the rest of the world will be affected.
The last global economic crisis was a financial heart attack. This one might be a full-body seizure. How can we tackle such crises? Let's ask our guest. Joining us now is David Bailey, Professor of Business Economics at the University of Birmingham, from Birmingham. Hello and welcome to the show, Mr. David Bailey. Do tell, for how long can Italy manage its economy without reopening its factories?
I think any of the economies badly affected, Italy, the UK, the US, are going to have to get the virus under control first before the economy returns to some sort of normality. If the economy is opened up too quickly and factories reopen, we could see a situation where many workers become ill and economic output is affected. People may choose to continue to isolate and not return to work. And also, I think confidence could be badly affected. So I think it's an issue of getting the virus under control. Now, clearly, in the case of Italy, there are some deep-rooted issues. The Italian economy has not really experienced much growth in the last 20 years since it joined the Eurozone. The banking system has a high degree of debt, which is likely to become worse the longer that this crisis and shutdown goes on. And there's going to be issues about whether the Italian government can service its debt.
Talking of other countries, how long will it take for the world to get back to its state before the pandemic?
We simply don't know how long this pandemic crisis will last, how long the economic downturn will take place, or what the state of a recovery could look like. So initially, people were talking about a kind of V-shaped economic recession, a sharp decline, and then a rapid recovery. There's an issue whether it could be a U-shaped recovery with more of a flattening out, or even possibly an L-shaped recovery, an L-shaped recession, with the recovery taking a long time to come. So we simply don't know how long this will take or what a recovery will look like.
Thank you, David. Talk to you again later. China has been dealing with COVID-19 since January. Beijing had to shut down every sector one after another. Now that the threat of the contagion is getting lower, many factories have started to reopen. But is everything going back to normal?
The coronavirus pandemic has taught us to expect a pattern. If today you see most European countries in lockdown, you can expect the same thing tomorrow in the US and sometime later in South America. So, if the outbreak has already caused disruption in China's industry, witnessing the same thing in Europe is no surprise. It has already started in Italy and soon will spread across the world. China, on the other hand, is slowly recovering. 3 weeks after the outbreak, the world's second largest economy practically shut down. The freeze set off warnings that the global economy could be in jeopardy if the world's preeminent manufacturing powerhouse stayed shut for long. Now, as some factories rumble back into action, the monumental task of restarting China is becoming clear. China's efforts to contain the virus are clashing with its push to get the country back to work, requiring the country's leaders to strike a balance between keeping people safe and getting vital industries back on track. So far, those factories that have reopened are operating well below capacity. For weeks after reopening, quarantines, blocked roads, and checkpoints have stopped millions of workers from returning to their jobs. Supply lines have been severed. Even to start up again, Chinese officials are requiring businesses to provide masks to workers, record their temperatures, and track their movements to make sure they haven't come into contact with the coronavirus, named COVID-19. Experts assumed that China's economy would slow sharply in the first half of this year before recovering as the epidemic was eventually contained.
China doing better in 2020, very important for China. It is also very important for the rest of the world, given China's share in the world economy.
But as we said before, China is for now the one example, a nation that struggled with the outbreak and is now trying to recover from it. What happened to China's industry will soon happen to the rest of the world.
Well, if China is slowly backing on track, other nations can do the same. But it most certainly will not be like when there was no pandemic. Let's see what our guest has to say about this. Hello again, David Bailey. What should we expect from the industrial sectors after the pandemic, and which industrial sectors do you believe would be worst hit?
Okay, if we think about manufacturing, it's actually very varied. So in the UK, for example, at the moment, some parts of manufacturing, food and drink manufacturing, are effectively having to run flat out to keep up with demand in supermarkets. So because people are stuck at home, they're stocking up on their food and their drink, the high level of demand in the economy. So that particular manufacturing sector is having to work really hard to keep up. Other sectors have been very badly affected. So, for example, the automotive industry is completely shut down because of the collapse in demand, people not going to showrooms, because of supply chains being disrupted, and also because of the need to protect their own workers.
Thanks for that. We've already talked about what is happening to industries in a world that is struggling with a pandemic. But what does the post-pandemic future look like for the industrial sectors?
The industrial sector of every nation affected by the pandemic will slow down, if not shut down entirely. Even after they reopen, it is not guaranteed if their products are still demanded in the market. The state of the world after the COVID-19 pandemic will be a more isolated one. At least for a couple of years, that's how it's going to be. Global supply chains and distribution networks will be disrupted. Due to the slowdown of the economy, people's priority will change. New phones, cars, and houses will become the last thing on people's minds, and instead, food, healthcare and economic security will be more important. COVID-19 is undermining the basic tenets of global manufacturing. Companies will now rethink and shrink the multi-step, multi-country supply chains that dominate production today. Global supply chains were already coming under fire economically. Due to rising Chinese labor costs, US President Donald Trump's trade war, and advances in robotics, automation, and 3D printing, as well as politically due to real and perceived job losses, especially in mature economies.
Сообщество единой судьбы, оно может рассматриваться именно, как такая идеологическое дополнение или идеологическое обоснование.
The novel coronavirus has now broken many of these links. Factory closings in afflicted areas have left other manufacturers, as well as hospitals, pharmacies, supermarkets, and retail stores bereft of inventories and products. On the other side of the pandemic, more companies will demand to know more about where their supplies come from and will trade off efficiency for redundancy. Governments will intervene as well, forcing what they consider strategic industries to have domestic backup plans and reserves. So one can predict that after the coronavirus pandemic, profitability will fall, but supply stability should rise.
A little grim, but not too scary. People across the world are having the same worries. What would our post-coronavirus future look like? Let's see some of their tweets. Now, some people are optimistic, like this one that says the world will be a better place after the coronavirus. Then there are people who, despite corona having a negative effect, in other words, there are people who believe the virus has a good side, a positive side to it. And we also found tweets in which people believed the pandemic helped governments blame their economic failures on the disease. Our guest is once again here with us in the studio. Welcome back, David Bailey. Now, nations would certainly be more isolated, at least for quite some time after the pandemic. Do you think the factories and industries will become more isolated as well?
You've got this sort of international industry where supply chains are connected. I think there is likely to be a rethinking of how that can make companies vulnerable if their supply chains are too exposed.
Thank you, David Bailey from Birmingham. That's it for today. Don't forget to watch the next episode of our program, The Outbreak. I've been Leila Faromazi, and on behalf of me and the whole team here, thanks for watching. Look after yourselves and each other.